Good morning, everybody. I welcome you to New York Law School and our City Law Breakfast. We'll begin in just a minute. We're letting more people coming in. We had a very large sign up for this breakfast, which I'm delighted to report. And we will begin in just a few seconds as more and more people sign in. In the old days, we'd be in the event center and people will be getting their coffee and sitting down and quieting down. But right now we're doing this via Zoom. We anticipate being back at the law school in the fall for our regular events, event center, and we're really anxious to do that. But right now, we're delighted so many people are here today, and we will begin in just a minute. Well, thank you all for coming. Good morning. On behalf of New York Law School and Dean Anthony Crowell, I welcome you to the 181st City Law Breakfast. I am Russ Sandler, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for New York City Law. Thank you for attending and for helping to make City Law Breakfast an important public forum. I wish to thank our generous and loyal founding sponsors for supporting these breakfasts for so many years. They are Consolidated Edison, Verizon, and the law firm of Greenberg Traurig. I also want to thank each of you who made a voluntary contribution when you signed up to attend the breakfast. Your name will be prominently listed in the email sent after every breakfast with the link to the video. We are enormously grateful for you and to the founding sponsors and for the voluntary contributions that help make these City Law breakfasts possible. After Greg Russ prepared remarks, we will have a question and comment session, which we always enjoy. You may submit a question or comment at any time during the breakfast, and we ask that you please do. We collect the questions and comments as they come in. To submit a question or comment, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And we do ask that you identify yourself with your first and last name and your organization. And following the question and comment period, Anthony Crowell, Dean of New York Law School, will join us for a concluding conversation. We are delighted to welcome to the City Law Breakfast Series the Chair and CEO of the New York City Housing Authority, Greg Russ. The New York City Housing Authority, or NYCHA, was established in 1934 during the administration of Fiorello LaGuardia in response to the housing crisis of the Great Depression. NYCHA reflects New York City's great heart and deep concern for the needs of its people. Along with the city's public schools, the public transit system, and the municipal hospitals, NYCHA is one of the crown jewels of municipal government, but is a jewel that needs much polishing and care. Since August 2018, when Greg Russ became the chair and CEO, he has worked hard to provide that polishing and care. Greg Russ, before coming to New York City, successfully led and strengthened public housing authorities in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Detroit. During the Clinton administration, Russ held a high housing policy position at HUD, and he has been a consultant on public housing to many public, private, and nonprofit housing agencies. Russ's personal credibility and his long and successful experience in public housing paid off last month when the New York State Legislature passed Russ's groundbreaking proposal for a public housing preservation trust. Greg Russ was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and grew up in New Cumberland, Pennsylvania. Russ's father was a steel worker and an electrician. Russ's father engaged young Russ in his interest in construction by often taking him to construction sites to help with wiring jobs. Russ's mother also worked in Russ's father's businesses and later part-time in local government. Russ worked as a night clerk in a motel after graduating from Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. This was 1972, and Hurricane Agnes had flooded central Pennsylvania with as much as 25 inches of rain. HUD staffers sent to provide relief for staying at the motel where Russ was the night clerk. Russ got to know the HUD staffers and asked about a possible job. The HUD staffer gave Russ an application to become a temporary housing inspector. This led to Russ's first public housing job with the Dauphin County Housing Authority, and that job led to Russ's extraordinary 50-year career in public housing. New York Law School is honored to welcome NYCHA Chair and CEO Gregory Russ to the City Law Breakfast Forum. The floor is yours.
Russ, thank you so much for a very kind introduction and for also bringing back some long ago memories, and also for the opportunity to speak at this forum. I really appreciate the invitation and the chance to have a conversation. And I thought I would divide up my comments into kind of three parts. And the first of those would be to think about the history of the public housing program. You kind of touched on it in your opening remarks. And, you know, we have to remember that, of course, this was a New Deal program, but its roots go back farther into the progressive movement at the turn of the century, the tenement houses movements that New York actually led, and other groups advocating for some kind of response by the government to terrible, terrible housing conditions or lack of housing altogether. The bill that passed in 1937 Housing Act, actually took several years to pass. If you read any of the legislative history of the bill, you'll find that the debates around what the government should or should not be doing, what type of housing that should be built, all the things that we think about and differ on many times are reflected in the debate that focused on that legislation. In the meantime, though, New York was actually ahead of the curve, because New York's housing authority was established before the 37 Housing Act and actually began to build housing even before that 37 Act was passed at first houses. So we have this long history of a program intended to provide a stable platform for families, provide really good living conditions, provide opportunities, at least initially as it was conceived, for families to spend time there, work their way out, and move on to another tranche in the economy. The program was originally envisioned that there would not be any local housing authorities, that there'd be the United States Housing Authority, and that housing authority would actually be responsible for building the housing at the local level. But constitutional issues precluded the administration's plan from even being tried. So the administration, the Roosevelt administration, shifted gears, and what the 37 Housing Act reflects is federal support and guarantees for the construction of housing, but it's done at the local level by an authority that's created by state enabling legislation, and that authority would own and operate the property. And then HUD would subsidize bonds issued by that housing authority so that those bonds would be backed by the full faith and credit of the US government. The change from a national to a local model also means that public housing, like other local programs, became part of the environment that it was built in. In some cases, this was a wonderful thing, and in some cases, this turned out to be a terrible thing. I think the housing that was built in the 30s and 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the program stopped building housing when Ronald Reagan became president. Much of this housing reflects the communities that it's in. I think one of the most magnificent things about New York is that New York pretty much built its housing everywhere. That's not true in a lot of cities. And some of the choices that were made as to the type of construction and location of these units led to further separation of the people that live in our apartments from the rest of the community. So this program evolved from a New Deal program. The program shifted again in the 60s because by the early 60s, the housing that was being built needed to be recapitalized. And this is the flaw that we're all dealing with now. The program has no mechanism for recapitalizing the buildings that it built. It got the construction underway, but 20, 30 years later, there was no capital fund to tap into to refurbish or replenish the systems in these buildings. NYCHA is a prime example of what happens when you put up a really sturdy property, one that in the beginning is designed well, services well, and then you go 60 years without putting deep investment into it. It's one of the reasons that our current state of public housing is so dire, that there hasn't been this regular investment in real estate and the real estate of public housing. And that has been a problem not only in New York, but throughout the country. The program's biggest evolutions came in the late 60s. The Brooke Amendment in 1968 created the rent system that we have now, or a first version of it. The the Nixon administration in the 70s created other program changes, including creating the Section 8 program in 1976. Reagan stopped the construction of public housing in 1981, and he also changed the rent formula, and so on. Through the following decades, modifications to the program were tried by Congress in various ways, but the basic program where you're paying rent based on income and you're living in a unit that's managed by a public agency did not change. So how does that bring us to NYCHA? NYCHA, like public housing around the country, had no mechanism to reinvest in its properties. The troubled agencies that existed in the early 90s created an actually troubled housing authority commission that developed into the Hope 6 program. But these were grants that were intended to do one site, not do an entire portfolio. And these were controversial too, because the Hope 6 has a mixed track record depending on what community it was applied in. So in a sense, we have not resolved how to put capital into these buildings in a systemic way. And that has plagued the program, because as time has passed, the buildings have weakened, and the buildings are much, much harder to manage today than they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago and before. When you talk to residents at NYCHA, they talk about how the properties used to be, and always it's described in a way that you can see from some of the archival pictures. But now what we've lost the structural integrity, the systems, and just general decline of these buildings. Secondly, even though these buildings were built with the best of intentions, they came with environmental issues. They came with lead paint, they came with asbestos, and they come with mold due to the age and the leaks in the properties. So NYCHA's properties reflected a housing that was in distress. NYCHA as an organization was also in distress. And when we started to think about how to rebuild both the organization and the property, it came from the basic tenets that are in the HUD agreement that NYCHA was compelled to sign on to several years ago. The Southern District had sued NYCHA on the lead issue. We settled, and the parties on that agreement are the Southern District of New York, NYCHA, the city, and HUD. And that compelled NYCHA to focus on compliance, to strengthen its integrity, to figure out how to deal with the environmental problems, to create better systemic responses inside the institution, not talking about the buildings, I'm talking about just reorganizing. And then in addition, if you read that agreement, it very quickly takes us from, you've got to do repairs better, you've got to be more open about what these issues are. And then you start to look at the term of the agreement and the amount of work required, and you very quickly realize we have to raise a lot of capital if we're going to have any hope of saving these buildings. And we're not the first agency to have to deal with that, but we couldn't do it in a traditional manner. We couldn't just look at a couple of sites and say, okay, we're going to transfer these over to a nonprofit or something like that. We did have the RAD program going at the time, and that has since continued. And actually, sometime this year, we'll have about 30,000 units in the RAD pipeline, and they'll all be revitalized over time. So that has continued to work well, but we still have like 110,000 or so properties, individual apartments, that we didn't have a plan for. And unlike other cities, we needed something that was ironclad. So we hit on the idea of creating a sister agency, the Public Housing Preservation Trust. Now, why would we do this? And this is where the difference between public housing as a program and the ability to finance and all the other programs that HUD manages really becomes stark. For public housing to change its fundamental income, that is the income when you add together rent and you add together the subsidy that HUD and Congress provide and the capital money that Congress is also providing, it isn't sufficient to support any kind of debt. It's not sufficient to go out and borrow money to do repairs. And the money that we get for capital from the US government. And this year was a banner year nationally. It's more money nationally than Congress has ever appropriated. But if you translated that same appropriation for the entire country into the need here in New York City, maybe at best you could do 3 properties. So the amount of money coming from DC for capital is not sufficient. So the idea was that NYCHA would create a sister agency because using existing federal law, you can transfer out of the public housing program, receive Section 8 tenant protection vouchers, attach those vouchers to the unit, and the difference in the funding allows you to borrow against the cash flow that you now have at that property. The transfer is executed by a ground lease. Nothing is sold. NYCHA retains its full responsibilities as an owner. NYCHA retains its full responsibilities as a housing authority. In a sense, the trust is a partner agency, but she's working for NYCHA and on behalf of NYCHA. The trust was intended to be a steward of the property, and it was intended to focus on several things. One, absolute protection for the public housing rights that families have right now under the public housing program and the lease that they signed with NYCHA. That's embedded in the legislation. Two, the trust is not intended to be an owner. It has a ground lease with NYCHA, so it has a long-term relationship under this lease, but the lease satisfies the need to meet the requirements of the federal agencies for the transfer. Three, the trust is intended to do the procurement and construction. The trust will contract back to NYCHA for property management, so the entire transaction is fully public. It's a public benefit corporation in the trust, and NYCHA is a public agency and housing authority. So the entire transaction is bookended by 2 strong public agencies. And this was intentional because the fear of privatization and loss of units is so thick. And in New York, especially, where many, many people have seen blocks and neighborhoods change in a matter of years, we wanted to be certain that once we do this, this is locked in perpetuity. The other thing that is in the trust are new procurement rules that, unlike any that the housing authorities had before, and frankly, we were talking about this the other day, there's not another housing authority in the country that now has the opportunity that the trust has to do procurement this way. The last thing is the trust includes a voting process that residents can choose to opt into the trust. They could choose to opt into RAD, or they can choose to wait and see how we do. And this election process is very unique. It's the first time it's been tried, but we felt on balance, it gave each property, each group of residents at that property, along with their tenant leaders, a chance to weigh in, to have the debate and make a choice. In addition, based on a lot of the feedback we got from residents, we have included residents on the Public Housing Trust Board, and there's a nomination process for that involves certain resident groups putting candidates forward, for example. Beyond that, we also have residents involved in quality assurance and quality control, because another thing we heard was we don't think you're keeping your eyes on the work that you are doing. And the next element of this is residents will actually be involved in the selection of the vendor that we use to do this massive construction. So the trust is kind of an investment engine, a construction engine, and an economic engine, because the amount of money that the trust can raise and that is required to invest in these properties is extraordinary. And The bill caps out the first tranche of trust properties at about 25,000 units. All in, that's probably somewhere between $5 or $6 billion, depending on the scope of work, and maybe a little higher if we start to think about electrification and those kinds of things. And frankly, that's those first tranches alone would equal 10 years of the national capital appropriation just in that first batch. So the trust was an important piece for us to begin to reinvest in our properties and save the buildings. No units lost, no families lost. But the second part of this, and I wanted to emphasize this as well, is we're not only rebuilding the properties, we have to rebuild the organization. And there's two investments required there. One, in our employees and investing in them in ways that advance their skills and opportunity to become better managers and provide better customer service. But the second, this much capital coming into a community, into a neighborhood. Many of our properties are their own neighborhoods, for example, or sometimes they're grouped in such a way that they become that. This much capital coming into this neighborhood provides significant economic opportunities for the families who live there. That's another part of the trust bill. The requirements around resident employment, requirements for resident engagement are all retained in the trust. But this kind of capital at this scale really, I think, is going to be a ground-breaking thing for the community. There's going to be opportunities for jobs. There's going to be opportunities for job training. And maybe the most fundamental thing, if we can give people a unit they can live in, a unit that's not compromised, a unit that's not defective. If you can do that to scale, that family doesn't have to worry about waiting for the plumber, waiting for the plasterer, worrying if the leak is somehow going to cause some other damage to their goods or their property. That family can just focus on being the family that they should be and doing the kinds of things that families with kids and others do all the time, which is take care of themselves and figure out how they're going to make their way through life. I think one of the things about having units in the condition we have is it robs individual family members and others of the chance to take some of the energy that they need to survive in that unit and then refocus it on their own pathway. So the goal is to give us a property and an apartment. When you go into it, you don't have to worry about the kinds of environmental things I mentioned earlier. You don't have to worry if you have kids under 6 about lead. The lead is gone, it's abated. You don't have to worry about mold because we've replaced all the piping. You don't have to worry about energy so much because we're switching over to other energy opportunities and things like that. We were changing heating systems from the kind we have now to more modern technologies. So we go back all the way to the foundation of the program, which rolled out pretty powerfully and continued to do so up into the early 80s. And then we got stuck. And we got stuck because we couldn't reinvest in these properties to make sure that the next generation of families was actually going to have a place to live if they're in a low income situation. So we're very excited about the twin efforts here to rebuild the units and rebuild our institution. We're very pleased to be at this pivot point for NYCHA. We have to get the trust launched, get it set up. We have to make sure that we issue the regulations on the voting process, and there's a number of steps we have to take, but it's really a powerful opportunity. And I want to thank the residents who supported us, the groups who supported us in getting this endeavor launched in Albany and passed. And I also want to thank my staff. Pretty nearly every single one of you has been involved in some way in making sure that we have a chance to do this. We now have the tool to raise the money, and we have to go out and do that. If we're successful, and I believe we will be, then we're going to have public housing serving families in New York City for another half century and beyond. So I'll stop there just to give you a flavor of the program, where NYCHA is and where our efforts are focused. and we can do some Q&A if that's appropriate.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you for the work that went into making sure that you had the legislation and the support and the staff work that went into it. There are a number of questions, but let me ask the audience. An important part of these programs is the opportunity to ask questions, and I hope that you will. You use the Q&A function. We do ask that you give your name and organization, but we would very much like to have as many good questions as possible during this time. So let's start with one from Polly Spain. As a resident of public housing, I have not received any information regarding the nomination of residents to the Board of Public Housing Trust, and have not yet been notified of the citywide election process that required qualifications to sit on the board. When will the residents of NYCHA receive notification and opportunity to be selected as a candidate for a seat on the board?
So there's two things that are going to happen in the next, say, 3 to 6 months. We're going to send out to every resident, we're actually going to send out a hard copy mailer, which has basic information on the trust, FAQs, and an actual copy of the trust legislation, which we thought we should include just to show people this is a real thing. Later in the year, we are compelled by the law to publish a set of draft rules on the local election process for properties that want to think about opting into the trust. So there's going to be plenty of time for public comment. There's going to be a proposed election cycle and process, and we hope to have that by October for comment by not only our residents, but other stakeholders. There is a nomination process. The citywide resident group and the resident advisory board are both charged in the legislation with coming up with candidates. So anybody who's interested perhaps in serving on the trust board, please contact your tenant association or contact the citywide CCOP or also the resident advisory board, because they're the groups that are named to propose candidates for selection by NYCHA or the city for the trust board. So the trust board, we're hoping actually we have a first meeting of the trust this year yet. More information on the trust itself is coming hard copy to every single resident. And then the election process, how that will work, we'll have draft rules for public comment, we hope by the fall, and then have a process for the local elections to opt in that we could commence next year if our timing holds up.
So could you put sort of a ballpark date when you think that this process will be completed?
If we can get the board established and hold our first trust meeting, I think we could start to hold elections early next year, and the first groups of properties that opt into trust, we can begin to bundle for financing. I think the most optimistic I could be is thinking about it might be possible for us to close on a financial transaction by the end of 23, but I think it's more likely early 24. We were probably working with our sister agency, HTC, on figuring out how to do the bonds and how much money we can raise on these first tranches. But if we can move with some aggressiveness, it's possible that we could be looking at a closing in 23, but for sure a closing in 24.
Very good, thank you. Here's a question from Ed LaGrassa. Are we spending more to upgrade units than to replace them?
I think that's a good question, but if we look at NYCHA buildings, the issue with NYCHA buildings is not so much the structure, it's the systems that that you can't continue to run these old boilers and hydronic systems in these buildings, but the bones of the building are in tremendous condition. So we think that the preservation approach makes the most sense in almost every circumstance because the property structure itself is in such good condition. I think to try and build new requires a couple things. First, we would have to be in a situation where the residents at that property would be willing to consider that. And that's been a hard sell for NYCHA because for the most part, everyone's waiting to see if we can actually fix the units we already have. And the second part of that is any kind of construction would have to be some additional plan where if families that might move into that, where we come back and we rehabilitate those units in the end eventually. Because frankly, the demand for the units is so high, we could build and rehab at the same time and never exhaust the demand for a low-income rental. But we think the repair and the preservation is the first part that NYCHA has to get its hands on and show that we can preserve units and keep families secure. So that's how we're thinking about that.
Okay, here's a question from Jim Meyer. Thank you for your lucid and compelling presentation. Very encouraging initiative. Then Jim Meyer asks, how will climate laws that promote the full electrification of buildings affect the ability of the trust fund to accomplish the goals that you have outlined?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have some opportunities. We have some opportunities because, frankly, some of our systems are so old, we'd be replacing them with brand new technologies anyway. And that's the opportunity. We don't need a central boiler, perhaps, with a distribution system and 10 buildings living off of one boiler room. We could think about building-based systems of various kinds. We could think about heat pumps in combination with other electrification choices. So we have a chance to create a new technological base at NYCHA that would be unprecedented in terms of its ability to save energy because we're so big. So the scale of it brings this great opportunity to, no pun intended, re-energize our buildings. And we think that there's going to be opportunities there. We also think once we can show the community, the capital and other communities, that we can do the basic work at the property, that other folks are going to want to be coming along to help us do some of the energy work as well. So we think we'll be able to tap into energy funding of all kinds. And at our scale, it's conceivable that we could electrify a substantial portion of the portfolio over the next 10 years and do that in a combination of ways that would really change NYCHA's repair profile, change NYCHA's utility profile, and create new technologies and opportunities for our employees and residents in terms of service and repair jobs.
Here's a question from Roland Nicholson, who identifies himself as a lawyer. Congratulations on your legislative success. At the Fortune Society, At the Fortune Society, we've long been concerned that our clients who lived in NYCHA housing before becoming guests of the State Correction Department, will NYCHA continue to allow them to return home to the NYCHA houses that they have left?
Yeah, we do have a really strong reentry program. And actually, we've been running that program for several years, and some of the criteria and policies in that program we've adopted for regular admissions as well. But yes, we have intentions to have a path there for reentry that makes sense and is built off the program that we've been running for reentry purposes for a couple of years now, and that has worked very well. And we're going to take those policy lessons and apply them to NYCHA as a whole.
This is from Dan Pendernock. He says, with a Section 8 voucher, there are requisite annual repair inspections done by the agency issuing the voucher. If the repairs are not completed within a certain time frame, the subsidy is suspended. Will these inspections be required for the trust, and which agency will be responsible for the inspections?
Yes, they will be required for the trust. The rules are pretty much the same as described. It's possible that we would have a third party doing the inspection since NYCHA actually still retains ownership of the building. And we'd want to make sure that the inspection process is neutral. So we would likely probably contract out that service for these units just to make sure there's some distance between us and the inspector, and we get a neutral and fair assessment of the housing quality standards in the unit.
This is from Mark LeBeau. Little personal note. He says he's excited to learn that you were born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. So was he. And he gives us hospital, French and Polyclinic Hospital on April 2nd.
Yeah, yes. I was in the Harrisburg Hospital, so I was about 10 blocks away.
Well, I think you guys ought to meet at the bar after this. In any event, he does have a question, and it's related to the Fortune Society. He says, does the public housing in New York City encourage admission of formerly incarcerated individuals? If so, how is that working out?
Well, we use the reentry program that I mentioned. So the considerations that we've learned to employ off of that program, we've adapted into our regular admissions. So we are very aware of reentry and have a set of policies around that. In fact, I think early this year or late last year, we did an amendment to our policies to adopt some of the things out of our reentry program. But we're going to continue to make sure that our thinking is in line with bringing folks back and giving them an opportunity to be reunited with their families.
Okay, in case you just missed, his name was Mark LeBeau, so you can see him later.
All right.
Robin and Bill Hubbard write, and this you're going to have a lot of questions like this, I am sure. How many board members are contemplated, and will they be statewide or will they be local subboards? So this is about how the new trust will operate.
I think there's 9 members contemplated, 5 appointed by NYCHA and 4 appointed by the city. It is a board for the trust. It's not statewide or anything like that at all. The legislation spells out pretty clearly the appointments and the nomination process for certain positions. So NYCHA has a set of rules in the legislation to follow for its 5, and the city will have for its 4 as well. So you know, if folks are interested in what that looks like, we could probably post something or provide a link to take a look at what's required there. Some NYCHA board members, for example, the CEO of NYCHA will automatically be on the board, as will the chief financial officer. We have to have 2 residents on the board and a 5th at large for NYCHA. And for the city, one of the deputy mayors or successor title, the city also gets to appoint a person from one of the labor unions who represents employees here at NYCHA. And then the city also has 2 resident slots to fill.
This is a question from Jim Meyer, and this really goes far into the future. He says, thank you for your lucid and compelling presentation and very encouraging initiatives. He says the trust, if all goes well, will address, as you said, 25,000 to 30,000 units, leaving 3 or 4 times that many. What is the thinking or planning for fixing others and are dealing with the continuing deterioration over time?
So we want to do the entire stock. When we negotiated the bill, the 25,000 unit number emerged because we thought in the inside of that number, we can readily prove the concept. And we can readily show that we can get properties back on track. We can raise the capital and get the construction going. Our plan for the rest of the portfolio is once we're showing that, we're going to go back to Albany to get the cap raised. And I don't know what that number might be in the second round, but this is very similar to what HUD did in the Obama administration when they proposed the rental assistance demonstration. The initial round of units that could be converted under that program were about 66,000. I think that caps up to about 450,000 or thereabouts. So our plan is to go back to the state legislature once we've shown that we can get work done, once we've shown that we can put units back online, and ask them to raise the cap so we can continue to go through the portfolio.
There's a question from Paul Gottsagen, who is with the New Yorkers for Parks. He says, have you been able to surmount NYCHA's traditional operational obstacles, embedded union and labor issues that cause higher repair cost delays and, he says, low morale and expectations? So he's talking about the labor union issues.
So I would say what we focus on the capital because the conditions of the properties cast a long shadow. And what I mean by that is that we could be operating with peak efficiency and still not be able to keep up with the failures that are occurring in the properties. It's just one thing to remember, that our baseline is just in a terrible place. But we're also compelled by the HUD agreement to restructure, reorganize, and reinvigorate NYCHA as an institution. We had to do a transformation plan. That transformation plan is for every property, is for every department at NYCHA, and we're in the process, we're in our second year plus of implementing changes under those plans. And these are hard. These are business process changes. There are changes to the work order system, changes to the number of staff we have. And I think that for us, this is long overdue. Like many bureaucracies, any large public bureaucracies, you tend to get an establishment of practice and culture. And sometimes it's perfect. It's exactly what you want. And sometimes you don't want it at all. And at NYCHA, we have some things that do work really well, but we also have business practices and approaches that have not worked at all. So in addition to looking to the capital, we are retooling all the departments. We just did a complete restructuring of the property management groups. We created a neighborhood model, which is a much more sane way of looking at the properties. We're going to embark on a program of education and support for the staff. And we have our contracts with our union partners. Yes, we do. But you know, those contracts, if you talk to any of the members, are providing a fair wage for a day's work. What we have to provide is the business systems to make sure that we can manage with our partners and manage to the problems that we have. So we are working on that as well. I feel like a lot of things we do related to the work order systems and so forth are not efficient. We have to change that. But that isn't necessarily because of who the person is. It's because of the NYCHA practice. And if we can change the NYCHA practice, then the person who does the repair can be in a better spot to make it work. So that's kind of how we're thinking about that.
Here's a related question from Chris Kipanak. Does the existence of the trust provide for ongoing maintenance in the future as well as capital improvements?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it will. Once we do the transfer to the trust and do the closings, raise the money and begin to do the investment, the property budget's going to change. And it's going to change in two ways. There'll be reserve accounts attached to the property, probably one for operating reserves and one for replacement or small capital reserves. So the property will be a lot more self-sustaining when you look at the total picture of the money coming in and the deposits to these reserve accounts. And again, these reserve accounts are intended to, the replacement reserves, for example, those are the kinds of things where, hey, I had a motor burn out in the elevator, I can get the money and take it out of the replacement reserve account and get the work done. So that's one thing that'll change. Over the long term, let's assume we issue bonds that have a 20-year life. At the end of the bond debt being retired, at the end of that period, the property can refinance again. And this is an attribute that most properties have, even subsidized properties that are owned by private owners or nonprofits can refinance periodically so that they can make sure they don't dig themselves into the deep capital hole that we've dug ourselves into here at NYCHA. So our hope is let's get the work done, get the units revitalized, and then 20 years from now, whoever's running NYCHA and the trust are going to have another set of good choices about how to put more money back in the property so we don't repeat this cycle, so we break it once and for all.
Here's another related question to these changes. Will the investments affect the cost of units to the residents? Given the value of the units will increase, who will cover the increase to rents, if any?
So the rent formula is the same in pre-trust and post-trust. There's the rent is based on income, 30% of monthly adjusted income. The structure for the rent, the deductions and so forth, all the things that HUD requires, it's the same on both sides of the transaction. So no rents are going to increase as a result of this. We have to adjust for some of our flat rent families. We're going to figure out how to adjust for them. These are families paying a fixed rent for various reasons. And aside from that adjustment, everyone else will continue to pay the rents that they have. And even with the flat rent families, we want to make this an easy transition. We're not looking to sock people with big rent increases in any form. So rents will pretty much be the same as they are now, but you'll have an apartment that's certainly much more worthy of the rent that you're paying.
This is from Scott Baker. The 4-tower private developer LSRD has started construction in the Lower East Side NYCHA properties. Will this private public construction mix be a part of NYCHA's support and mixed housing future? He's from River Arch Ventures.
So the rental assistance demonstration program, which is the other tool that we have, in that program, the RAD program, we solicit invitations from a development team, private developer usually, often partnered with a nonprofit service provider and a private management company. So the RAD program will continue to be where NYCHA is working in partnership with private entities to revitalize the property. In the RAD, the model's the same. There's a ground lease to the group that's going to redevelop the site, just like there's a ground lease to the trust. So in that environment, we're going to continue to do public-private partnerships. In the trust model, because the trust is really standing in for the development team, there's not a private developer or private manager. The trust is contracting to NYCHA to do the management. Now, it's possible on some of the energy work that we do down the road, there might be opportunities on the energy side of the financing to do some things that might not be typical. That could involve a relationship with a private entity that's providing, say, a piece of equipment, technology, or service. But the trust model is definitely different than the RAD model and relies more on public-to-public transaction. Hey, Ross, hit your mic. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Try not to do that. This is from Christopher Rizzo related. What's the status of the prior mayor's infill plan for several housing sites? And I'm afraid this will be the last question. I'm going to bring in Anthony Crowell after this. Thank you. Go ahead.
Sure. So NYCHA has not stopped looking for opportunities. We have a couple of infill properties that have come to fruition. I think one of the big obstacles to even thinking about infill is if I'm sitting there on the site and you're proposing a new building and I'm in a unit that has leaks, lead or asbestos, I'm thinking, why in the heck are you building that and not taking care of me today now? I think if we can begin to show the families who live in these properties that we're serious about giving them a good place to live, over time, the attitude towards infill may change, because I think it's viewed as a competition for resources as opposed to supplementing. So we've not abandoned the idea. We're not opposed to the idea. If we have a property that's interested, we'd certainly talk to the residents there. But I think that once we begin to show that we can begin to restore the stock we have, our options at the properties are going to increase, because people are going to feel more comfortable taking on something that they didn't think about because their unit's fixed.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the excellent questions. And now I want to bring in Anthony Crowell, Dean of New York Law School, to continue the conversation with Greg Russ. Welcome, Dean Crowell. You're on mute.
Yes. Thanks so much, Professor Sandler. I appreciate this. And it's great to have you, Greg. We really appreciate the wonderful conversation and your perspectives. And I have to say that you have been a breath of fresh air at NYCHA. The city has long needed compelling leadership, and leadership that understands public housing through and through from every aspect, and you've brought that. So as a former public servant and somebody who cares deeply about NYCHA, its residents, and its future, I thank you.
Thank you.
I have been a student of public housing, at least during part of my life. I'd love to hear your perspective. I think others would too, as you look back over a remarkable 50-year career. What do you see as the greatest shift in American housing policy that's sort of brought public housing authorities to this moment, many of which would say is a moment at the brink?
I think there's a couple things to think about inside that question, if I could. HUD runs through Congress really two programs. There's a public housing program and all that has. But then there's the voucher program, which includes project-based vouchers, includes the original Section 8 programs that were launched in the 70s, which a lot of that housing is still around. And I think one of the things on the public housing side is the Section 8 investments, because of the way that subsidy works and because of the way those properties were conceived of in the beginning as having the tools to refinance. So there's this split in resources in effect. I'm not saying a Section 8 owner can't be a bad owner. There are some. I think that has led to this marginalization of public housing in terms of the money it needs, in terms of how it's seen as a program. And when you go to DC to make the case for public housing operating subsidy, the kinds of things in the operating subsidy formula are so arcane, no one understands what the hell you're talking about. And that's a different, if you're a nonprofit with a 202 program and you're serving seniors, you're going to get an automatic OCAF adjustment factor. So my point is that we have undercapitalized this program and overregulated it in some ways. I'm not talking about the tenant rights and protections. I'm talking about some of the other things that have happened over the years. And I think those two things together, lack of capital and lack of flexibility, have made the program really, really difficult to manage and have contributed heavily to where we are today in this city and other cities around the country.
What do you think we'll see from HUD in the next few years to come with this administration, and where are its commitments?
Well, I want to say that on a level I've not experienced in my time doing this, HUD has been with us as we try to rebuild the organization every step of the way. They've been a great technical and logistical partner. Also, HUD took the unprecedented step of sending letters to both the State Assembly and the Senate in support of the trust bill. And I've never seen them do that, and I thank them for that. But I think, to answer your question, I think we have to look at understanding that the public housing portfolio, not just in New York, but all over the country, is shifting into a project-based voucher portfolio. I think the administration is going to have to think about how they're going to address that. What does that mean in terms of the numbers of vouchers and the transition vouchers that are being added on to each year? I think how that plays out in the near term is going to be impacted by the election in November.
Mhm.
I don't know how, I don't know what's going to happen in the House or the Senate. I mean, we all have concerns, of course, but if the Dems retain, the budget process is different. If the Dems lose, I think it's different still. And in the near term, we'd have to think about what kind of investments could be put in those budgets that could get passed before we have a sort of a new congressional group to deal with. I'm hopeful that we continue to work closely with this HUD, and we're certainly interested in sitting down with them also when the time comes to think about policy at large. But you know, the administration has been very supportive of our efforts here, and I just want to acknowledge that.
Right. So the trust now is law, and it creates a compelling policy and legislative framework. Have any other public housing authorities come to you to start learning from the early stages of the experience? And obviously, that community is watching to see how successful this will be.
I've had one inquiry so far from a housing authority in California, which but I think folks are interested in the mechanisms because a lot of the mechanisms in other parts of the country are tax credit dependent. In other words, the equity and the raise to put the capital in don't come necessarily from a bond issue. And the one thing that we think is that the bond issue process, once we get it on the rails, will be more efficient over time, because once you get in the cycle and you have the revenue to back the bonds, then things become easier like the third or fourth time you're out in the market. The question I have is whether that is more efficient than some of the other financial structures that we've seen, and whether that would pay out for other agencies as well. But we'll probably be talking in the fall when the industry conferences begin to start up again. And I hope we can share some of the things we've seen here and share that with anybody who's really interested in understanding what we're trying.
I was glad that Professor Sandler spoke about your entree into public housing way back when, and the unique place you found yourself in order to make that contact with HUD officials. You know, our law school has a very deep commitment to housing policy and housing justice, have a broad array of programs that our students are deeply engaged in. What career advice might you have for them about how to best map out a career in housing law generally, and certainly being an advocate for effective public housing?
Well, first, I think I've worked with so many people here at NYCHA and in other places across the country who studied law, came out as a lawyer, maybe even practiced for a time, and then shifted their goals. Some things to remember. One, I think the law training prepares you to read and understand the rules, and then think creatively about how to apply those rules. I taught to our interns. We have a group of law interns here at NYCHA. I taught to them yesterday. And the thing that I tried to emphasize to them is, look, you got the training, you have the structural training in the law, and the thing about, you've got to use your imaginations. You have to kind of pierce the regulation and figure out, is that going to work as a program? That's true for policies. NYCHA has a lot of policies that we've gotten rid of. There's more to do. It's kind of like pruning. And but the thing that I think for folks that are thinking about this career is, you get your sort of basic training and you come out, and the policies helping implement the program is tremendously powerful, gives you practical experience that you might not be able to get just in the classroom. But the second part of that is your foundation through the law school and your studies there does prepare you for dealing with figuring out how to deal with knotty public policy issues, but then how to put a program that or a pilot that might try to address that. So you get both if you can, and you drop in some imaginative ideas, and suddenly you're on your way.
There you go. Here's my last question. Rumor has it on the street that you're an avid reader. Summer is upon us. What's a must-have book to have in our beach bags?
I'm reading a really excellent biography of Ulysses Grant. I just finished Anna Karenina, which is not for the faint of heart, but is well worth it. If I don't think you can get it done in a beach day by any stretch.
It's an interesting moment in time to read Anna Karenina.
It is, yes.
If I may, my friend.
Yeah. So, yeah, you learn a lot about Russian farming techniques in the 19th century. So, but it's a great read, and the biography of Grant is a great read. The other one I have that I just finished is something, I think it's Ellis, American Creation, which is a series of vignettes where he takes a section of history and goes deep into it. And one of the interesting ones he does is after the Constitution's adopted, our first negotiations with Native Americans on treaty rights occurred here in New York. And it was with the Creeks, who occupied what is now Georgia. And the negotiators were Washington, Jefferson, and General Knox. So, yeah. So you kind of also read some of the dysfunction that existed at the beginning of our country, which we've survived even as we deal with some of the dysfunction that we have now. So
I'm noticing a theme of an appreciation for leadership and governance systems.
Yes.
So
you learn, I mean,
well, it makes you an effective leader. You are effectively running your own jurisdiction. I mean, you know, NYCHA put together is the size of Atlanta. So
yeah.
So yeah, that's not to be you know, to go unrecognized.
Sure. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. We are so pleased.
I hate to bring this conversation to a close, but we do have
Anthony.
to.
Yeah.
I thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Chair Russ. I'd like to end, though, with a comment that I heard Greg Russ say at another meeting with the Citizen Budget Commission. He said his goal was this: can NYCHA be believed? And I think the transparency and the conversation like this is extremely helpful in making that happen. And if you can get people to believe what NYCHA says, then you will have accomplished a huge amount and made this a better city. Thank you so much for this morning, and thank you for all you're doing for New York City.
Thank you, Russ.
We'll see you
Thank
in
you,
the
Anthony.
fall.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Bye-bye.